You plant the wrong seed bag or something, son? The trucker leaned out his window on Route 9, squinting at the field like it had insulted him. Where 40 acres of soybeans should have stood, there was nothing but sunflowers, thousands of them, gold heads lifting into a sky still streaked with pink. The young man kneeling in the dirt didn't even look up from his notebook. "Nope," he said. "Right seed, right field." "Then what in the world are you doing?" No answer. Just a small, tired smile and the scratch of a pencil. By noon, half the county was laughing. Russell Whitfield's boy had thrown away the best ground in 3 generations to grow flowers. But nobody thought to ask him why he was really smiling. The young man kneeling in the dirt that morning was Darius Whitfield, and though the driver on Route 9 had known his face for years, the man still shook his head the whole way into town, the way people do when a thing they've always understood suddenly refuses to make sense. Darius had come to the farm when he was small, and the land had raised him almost as much as Russell had. Russell Whitfield was the 3rd generation of his family to work this ground. 210 acres of dark Iowa loam that had grown corn and soybeans since Russell's own grandfather cleared the first 40 acres by hand with a mule and a borrowed plow. Russell had spent 40 years coaxing a living out of the rest of it, trusting the almanac and his own aching knees over any forecast a phone could offer. He was a widower, gray at the temples, slow to speak and slower to change his mind. And when he had signed the papers making Darius his son, he had done it with the same quiet permanence he brought to everything else. He did not say much about love. He showed it by handing over responsibility, 1 row at a time. Darius had grown up walking those rows before he could read the labels on the seed bags. He knew the smell of the soil after a hard rain, and the particular hush that settled over the fields just before a storm rolled in from the west. He knew the sound a combine made when it was running clean, and the different sound it made when something underneath was about to break. Most of the boys he'd gone to school with couldn't wait to leave for the city the minute they turned 18. Darius had finished high school that spring with no such itch. What he wanted was already spread out in front of him under the sky. The one thing that set him apart wasn't the color of his skin, though the county noticed that too, in the quiet way small places notice everything. It was the way he thought about the land. Somewhere in his high school years, between chores and long summer afternoons, Darius had started reading things most farmers his age never touched. Soil biology, pollinator behavior, long studies full of charts that he'd order through the library and carry out to the porch and work through with a pencil, underlining, arguing with the authors in the margins. Russell had watched this happen with a mixture of pride and mild bewilderment. When Darius tried to explain what he was learning, the explanations ran long and wandered into words Russell had never needed in 40 years of farming. And eventually, Russell stopped asking. The previous spring, after Darius had proven himself right about a handful of small things nobody else had noticed first, Russell had done something that surprised them both. He handed the boy the original 40 acres, the ground his own grandfather had cleared, and told him to run them however he liked. Call it an experiment. Call it giving the boy rope. Either way, it was his to manage now, and Darius had spent the year since studying that particular ground the way a doctor studies a patient. That was where the trouble started. When the seed order came in that spring, Russell had been standing at the kitchen counter with his first cup of coffee, thumbing through the invoices the way he did every year, and his hand went still on one page. "Sunflowers," he read. "The whole 40 acres." He set the coffee down slowly. "Darius," he called toward the back room where the boy was pulling on his boots. "This says sunflowers. All of it." Darius came to the doorway. "That's right. You know sunflowers don't pay like beans do." "I know." Russell waited for the rest. In his experience, a statement like that came with a paragraph attached. But Darius only tightened the laces on his boots and reached for his cap. And after a moment, Russell realized no paragraph was coming. Over the past year of watching his son run those 40 acres, he had learned that the boy's silences usually meant he had a reason he wasn't ready to share. and that pushing never brought the reason out any faster. So he let it go. The way a man lets go of a rope, he has decided not to fight anymore, and he carried his coffee out to his own fields and left the strange decision where it lay. The neighbors were not built for that kind of patience. By the second week, the sunflowers were up past a person's knee, unmistakable now to anyone driving by, and Marlene's diner on Main Street had itself a fresh topic. Hank Coors held court at the corner table most mornings. Hank had worked ground 2 miles east of the Whitfields for 30 years, and his own father had once set the county soybean record on that same ground, a fact Hank reminded everyone of at least twice a season. 40 acres, Hank said, turning his coffee cup a slow quarter turn against the saucer. 40 acres of flowers. You believe that? Maybe the kid just likes how they look, someone offered from the next stool. Heard he's been saying he wants the place to feel less like a factory and more like a farm, said another. The table laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh exactly, but it was the kind that stings anyway when it finally reaches the person it's aimed at. The laugh of people who have already decided they know the whole of a story from the outside. By the following week, it had hardened into settled fact all over town. Russell Whitfield's boy had gone and planted 40 acres of pretty flowers because he wanted the place to look nice for once. Nobody thought to ask Darius whether that was true. They simply assumed it, the way a small town assumes things, and then moved on to whose barn needed a new roof and whose daughter was getting married in the fall. Darius heard about it the way a person always hears these things in a small place, second-hand, softened a little by whoever was kind enough to carry it to him, the sting arriving intact regardless. His cousin Beth caught up with him at the feed store on a Thursday, following him out to the truck with her arms crossed against the wind. "People are saying you wasted the good ground," Beth said, keeping her voice careful. "Aunt Carol's worried you're going to lose the farm payment this year." Darius swung a bag of feed up into the bed of the truck before he answered. "I'm not going to lose the payment." "How do you know?" He looked at his cousin then, and it wasn't an annoyed look, only tired, the look of a young man answering a question he had already answered 100 times inside his own head. "Because I did the math before I put a single seed in the ground." "Then why won't you just tell people what the math is?" Beth threw up her hands. "It would take you 5 minutes and everybody would leave you alone." Darius leaned against the side of the truck and considered how to say it. If he explained the plan now, halfway grown and unproven, it would sound like a guess. Worse, it would sound like a boy showing off a stack of library books nobody had asked him to read, applying ideas from a study to soil that 3 generations of real farmers had already figured out just fine. In a town like this one, a young man who looked like him did not get the benefit of the doubt on a hunch. He got it on results, or he didn't get it at all. "Because right now, nobody would believe me," he said finally. "They'll believe the harvest." Beth didn't push any further. She climbed into her own car and drove home. And the whole way she found herself wondering whether her cousin had lost his nerve for regular farming, or whether he'd seen something in that ground that nobody else could see yet. She couldn't decide which, and that not knowing bothered her more than she expected. What the county didn't understand, what none of them could have guessed from the road, was that the sunflowers weren't a whim at all. They were the visible edge of something Darius had been building quietly since his last year of high school, and the reason he could stand at his truck and say he'd done the math was that he had. Every figure of it. The decision to stay silent cost him more than he let on. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to walk into Marlene's and lay the whole plan out on the counter. Every day he chose silence instead. He was choosing to let people think less of him than he knew was fair. From the outside, it looked like stubbornness, maybe even foolishness. From the inside, it felt like standing very still while a wind he couldn't control blew hard against him, and refusing, for reasons only he understood, to reach for the shelter that was right there. Twice that week, he'd noticed his father drive the far edge of the property slow, past the tree line, looking out at those 40 acres of green like he was trying to read them too. Russell never commented. He just looked and drove on. And Darius understood that his father was doing his own quiet math, weighing a lifetime of trusting the almanac against a year of watching his son be right about small things nobody else had noticed first. That was where the season truly began. Not with the planting, which the whole county had already turned into a joke, but with a choice. Darius had chosen to carry the whole weight of the plan alone, and to let the harvest be the only argument he ever made. He didn't yet know that the ground was about to test that choice in ways no chart had prepared him for, or that before those sunflowers ever bloomed, the sky itself would turn against him. The test came as an absence. By the middle of June, a dry spell had settled over the county that no forecast had called for. 2 weeks without rain stretched into 3, and then into a 4th, and the ground that had been dark and generous in the spring began to pale and crack at the edges of the rows. 2 farms over, a man's corn started curling its leaves inward by midday, a defense against losing moisture that any farmer in the county could read at a glance, and reading it, feel a cold weight settle into his own stomach. Darius's sunflowers were still young, still sinking their roots down toward water that kept retreating deeper into the soil, and they began to struggle. Sunflowers are stubborn plants by nature, deep drinkers once they're established, but these had not been in the ground long enough to be stubborn yet. They needed the one thing the sky refused to give. Darius walked the rows every evening after his other chores were done, crouching at intervals to press his fingers into the dirt and feel how far down the dryness went, watching the broad young leaves for the first telltale droop that meant a plant was starting to give up. His father found him out there one night near 10 o'clock, a flashlight in one hand, kneeling at the end of a row with his notebook open on his knee the way it always was. "You're going to lose some of this if it doesn't rain soon," Russell said. He didn't say it to be cruel. He said it the way farmers say hard things to each other, plainly, because pretending otherwise helps no one. "That's a lot riding on a flower crop with no market contract behind it, son." Darius sat back on his heels and let the flashlight drop so its beam pooled on the dirt between them. "I've got a lot riding on what comes after the flowers, Dad." Russell studied his son in the thin light. He didn't understand what the boy meant, not fully, but he had farmed long enough to know that a person sometimes needed room to try a thing, even when the thing looked like foolishness from every angle a neighbor could see it from. He looked out at the dark shapes of the rows for a while, and then he said the only thing he had to offer. "I'll run the irrigation line down this way if you need it." It was the closest Russell Whitfield had ever come to saying out loud that he believed in what his son was doing, and Darius knew it. A lump rose in his throat that he was glad the darkness hid. The two of them stood together at the edge of the failing field for a moment before walking back to the house, neither of them saying anything more, because nothing more needed saying. The rain came 8 days later, hard and sudden the way summer storms do in that part of the country, the sky going green-gray in the late afternoon, and then opening all at once, turning dust to mud in under an hour. Darius stood on the porch and watched it come, and he did not go inside until he was soaked through, because after 8 days of watching his gamble wither, he wanted to feel the thing that was saving it. The sunflowers, which had been bending and pale, drank deep and came back within days, greener and taller, and, now that their roots had been forced to reach, tougher than they'd been before the drought ever started. What had nearly killed them had, in the end, made them harder to kill. But the rain did not come alone. The deer had always lived along the tree line at the edge of the property, browsing the brush and the wild edges where the cultivated ground gave way to woods. In all the years of corn and soybeans, they had never bothered the crop fields much. But a young sunflower, tender and standing in a dense stand of thousands, was another thing entirely, and the rain that revived the crop seemed to draw the deer out of the tree line to discover it. Darius walked out one morning after the storm and stopped cold. Nearly 2 acres along the wood's edge had been trampled and grazed in the night. Young sunflower heads, the first hard buds just forming, had been bitten clean off. Hoof prints stood pressed deep into the soil the rain had softened, a record written in mud of exactly how many animals had come and how thoroughly they had worked the rows. He stood at the edge of the damage for a long moment with something tightening in his chest. This was the moment he would come back to later, when he tried to be honest with himself about that summer. The drought had frightened him, but the drought was weather, impersonal, a thing that happened to everyone. The deer felt different. The deer felt like the season itself had decided to test not the science, which he still trusted completely, but him. Whether he had the stamina to see a hard idea all the way through when the whole county was already leaning forward, waiting for him to fail. Standing there in the wet dirt, he felt the doubt he'd held off all spring finally find a crack and slip inside. Not doubt about the plan. Doubt about whether he was the right person to carry it. He did not call his father. He did not call Beth or anyone else. Some instinct told him that if he was going to prove he could hold steady through this, the proving had to start with him handling it alone. He got in the truck and drove to the hardware store in town and bought what he needed. Motion-activated sprinklers and a long roll of reflective tape, the kind that flashes and moves in the wind and unsettles a browsing animal without doing it any harm. He remembered the tape from an offhand comment Wendell Marsh had made once, years back, about keeping deer out of a research plot without ever touching them. For the next 3 evenings, after his regular chores were done and the light was going, Darius worked the tree line. He set the sprinklers at intervals and ran their lines, hung lengths of the tape where the wind would catch them, and walked the rows, testing the ranges so the spray would trip when a deer stepped close and not when the wind merely stirred. He came inside each night after dark with his boots soaked and his jeans streaked to the knee, and he slept hard and got up and did it again. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind nobody would ever see or credit, and that was almost the point. He was not doing it to be seen. He was doing it because the alternative was to let 2 bad acres become the whole field, and the whole field become proof that the town had been right about him all along. Hank Kors saw him out there on the 3rd evening and slowed his truck on the road, letting the engine idle while he leaned an elbow out the window. "Heard about the deer getting into your flowers," Hank said. "Tough break." Darius didn't stop what he was doing, adjusting the last sprinkler head along the row. "It's manageable," he said. Hank watched him a moment longer than the conversation required. He had expected, driving up, to find the boy looking beaten, and a part of him, if he was honest, had been ready to feel a little satisfied about it. But the boy didn't look beaten. He looked like someone with a problem and a plan for the problem, working the plan in the failing light with no particular interest in whether anyone approved. It unsettled something in Hank that he'd have had trouble naming. "You know," Hank said slowly, "my granddad used to say the ones who keep working after a setback are usually the ones who end up being right." He drummed his fingers once on the door of the truck. "Doesn't mean I understand a thing you're doing out here, but I'll say that much." It wasn't belief. Darius knew the difference, but it was the first crack in the town's certainty. The first time anyone in that county had looked at his 40 acres and considered, even for a moment, that the joke might be on the people telling it. He nodded his thanks, and Hank drove on, and Darius stood in the dark with the tape flashing softly around him and let himself feel, for the first time in weeks, something that was not quite hope but was pointed in its direction. Then, in the middle of July, everything the plan had been building toward quietly began. The sunflowers bloomed in earnest, 40 acres of them turning their heavy gold heads toward the light in a wave that took even Darius by surprise with its suddenness. And with the bloom came the thing that no one driving past on Route 9 could have explained. Bees arrived. Not the scattered handful that drift through any flowering field in summer. Thousands of them. Wild bumblebees came up out of the field margins. Honeybees came from keepers' hives miles in every direction, and countless small native pollinators Darius couldn't always name on sight converged on the sunflower rows, pulled in by the sheer density of the bloom and the reliability of the reward, day after day, a food source so rich and so consistent that the insects reorganized their whole routine around it. That was the part Darius had been waiting to see with his own eyes, and to understand why it mattered, you have to go back to where the idea was born. In his junior year of high school, Darius had talked his way into a weekend field course taught by a retired agricultural extension agent named Wendell Marsh. Wendell was a soft-spoken man in his 70s who had spent 4 decades studying pollination patterns across the Midwest, back before anyone outside a handful of universities cared about the subject at all. One afternoon, he had put up satellite data comparing crop yields on farms that used pollinator strips against farms that didn't, and the difference on the screen had not been small. In some cases, it was staggering, a gap wide enough that Darius had sat forward in his seat and stopped taking notes just to look at it. "Bees don't respect property lines," Wendell had told the class, tapping the screen with one knuckle. "If you give them a reason to stay close, they'll do the work for your neighbor's crops too. And if you're smart about it, you make sure some of that work benefits you first." Darius had caught the old man afterward and asked him the question that had been forming the whole hour. Not how to attract pollinators, everyone knew a flower attracted bees, but how to hold them. How to keep them working the same square mile day after day instead of drifting through once and moving on. Wendell had smiled like he'd been waiting years for a student to ask exactly that. "Sunflowers," he'd said, "if you do it right. Long bloom window, high nectar reward. Bees build a habit around a good sunflower stand, and once they've built a habit, they don't stay confined to the one field. They work everything in reach." He hadn't said much more than that, not that day, but it had been enough to plant something in Darius that took the next 2 years to grow its roots. It hadn't been a gimmick, it had been a strategy, one used quietly by a small number of forward-thinking growers around the country, but rarely attempted on the scale Darius was about to try. In the time since, in every spare hour, he had studied everything the research could tell him about how pollinator traffic behaved, mapping out exactly where on his family's land a stand of sunflowers would do the most good. Because the plan had never actually been to grow sunflowers. The plan was to grow something else better, using the sunflowers as the engine that drove it. And the something else was already in the ground, waiting. Across the tree line from the 40 acres of gold sat 20 acres of hybrid soybeans that Darius had planted that same spring, quietly, with none of the attention the sunflowers drew. Soybeans are mostly self-pollinating, which is exactly why nobody in the county gave the field a second look, but mostly is not entirely. And buried in the research Darius had worked through was a finding he had confirmed across a dozen separate studies before he ever placed a seed order. When pollinator traffic increased near a soybean field, the plants set more pods and filled those pods fuller. The bees the sunflowers held in place were not staying in the sunflowers. They were spilling across the tree line into the soybeans, working those blooms too. And every trip they made was quietly adding weight to a harvest still weeks away. He had built a pollinator engine, and standing at the edge of the field in the middle of July, watching the steady traffic move between the gold and the green, Darius could see that it was running exactly as the numbers had promised it would. He had not built it entirely alone. That spring, before the joking in town had even started, Darius had gone to see a beekeeper named Otis Reyes, who kept hives on the far side of the county, and he had made the man an offer that Otis found, at first, difficult to take seriously. Free placement for his hives at the edge of the sunflower field, in exchange for nothing at all except Otis's agreement to let Darius track the bees' activity through the season. Otis had studied the young man across his kitchen table and wondered aloud why anybody would want hives parked on ground the whole county had already written off as wasted. But he was a curious man underneath the skepticism, and a free flowering field is not a thing a beekeeper turns down. And so he'd said yes. By July, Otis was calling the farm almost every evening. "Darius, I've kept bees for 22 years, he said one night, the two of them standing at the edge of the field watching a steady stream of insects move in and out of a hive entrance in the last of the light. "I have never seen hives this active this early in a season. Whatever you put in this ground, they have lost their minds over it." "That's the idea," Darius said, watching the same steady movement with a quiet that had a great deal of satisfaction folded into it. "Now we wait and see what it does for everything around it." He still had not told anyone the whole of it. Not his father, not Beth, not even Otis, who understood the bee half of the plan perfectly and knew nothing of the soybean half at all. Darius wanted the numbers first. But the waiting was not the peaceful thing it might sound like. Every good sign came braided together with a fear, because Darius understood better than anyone how much was still unproven. Looking healthy was not the same as filling out heavier than any field on that ground had filled in years, and until the combine ran the numbers in the fall, everything he believed was still, technically, a theory. He had staked a whole season, his father's oldest ground, and his own standing in a town that already doubted him, on a chain of reasoning that had never once been tested at this scale on this soil. He did the only thing he knew to do with a fear he couldn't resolve. He counted. 3 mornings a week, all summer long, Darius walked measured stretches of the field and counted pollinators by hand, marking the tallies in the notebook that was never far from him, building a record week over week that he could set beside the yield when it finally came. Either way, he was determined not to reach the end of the season with nothing but a feeling. He would have the numbers. The numbers were the one thing that could not be laughed at. The answer he had waited so long for did not arrive on the day of harvest. It arrived early, in the first week of August, and it arrived by way of his father. Russell had taken to walking the far soybean field in the evenings, though he never said why, and Darius never asked. He was walking a middle row one evening with the low sun behind him when he stopped short and stood, and did not move for a long while. The pods were fuller than he had seen them in years, not the kind of difference a man could talk himself into or out of depending on his mood. They were noticeably, undeniably heavier, row after row, the plants themselves seeming to strain under a weight that had no business being there in a field nobody had done anything unusual to. Russell crouched down right there in the dirt and split a pod open with his thumbnail, and then another, and then a third, because he had farmed this ground for 40 years and he did not trust his own eyes to tell him something his experience said couldn't be true. He called Darius out to the field that evening. "Explain this to me," Russell said, holding up a handful of pods when the boy reached him, his voice caught somewhere between wonder and something close to accusation. "Because either I am losing my mind, or something you did with those flowers is showing up over here in my beans, and I've split enough of these open now to know it isn't my mind." Darius looked at the pods in his father's hand, and then out across the tree line at the gold field beyond it, still humming faintly with the last light's traffic, and he felt the whole summer's held breath finally start to leave his body. This was the moment. Not the harvest, not the trucks. This. His father standing in a soybean field with the proof in his open hand, asking to be shown the thing Darius had been carrying alone. "Sit down, Dad," he said. "I'll show you the notebook." They sat together at the edge of the field as the light went down, and Darius walked his father through all of it, slowly, from the beginning. He told him about Wendell Marsh and the satellite data that had made him sit forward in his seat. He explained the difference between a plant that attracts pollinators and one that holds them in place, and why holding them was the whole game. He turned the notebook pages one by one, the bloom time charts, the soil moisture logs he'd kept through the drought, the pollinator counts he'd tallied by hand all summer, and the projected yield comparisons he'd built against the same ground's numbers from the year before. And he explained at last the piece he had told no one, that he had planted the sunflowers exactly where he had in order to drive the bees across the tree line into the soybeans, the crop that actually had to sell, so that a field mostly capable of pollinating itself would set more pods and fill them fuller than it ever had on its own. Russell sat quietly for a long time after his son finished, turning a single soybean pod over and over in his thick fingers, the way a man handles a thing he is trying to make himself believe. "You've been carrying this whole plan by yourself," he said finally. "I needed to know it would work before I asked anyone to believe it would," Darius said, especially you. If I'd told you in the spring, it would have just been a boy talking. I wanted the ground to say it instead of me." His father nodded slowly, and something settled into the deep lines of his face that Darius had not seen aimed at him before. Something past approval and into the country of real pride. "Well," Russell said, looking out at the darkening rows, "looks like the ground's saying it." Harvest came in the last week of September. The custom harvester Darius had hired ran the sunflowers first, and the heads came off heavy and bowed with seed, filling the trucks faster than the man had budgeted for. Those trucks had somewhere to go, because months earlier, once Darius had confirmed his germination rates and the health of the stand, he had quietly lined up an oil-crushing contract for the seed, a contract nobody in the county had known existed until the trucks actually started rolling toward it. So the flowers everyone had laughed at were, it turned out, already sold, and selling well. But it was not the sunflowers that stopped people. It was the field beside them. When the combine moved into the 20 acres of soybeans, the yield monitor in the cab began climbing to numbers that made the driver, a lean and unsentimental man who had harvested half the county's fields for 2 decades, lean forward and frown at the screen. He ran a full pass, and then he stopped the machine in the middle of the row, climbed down from the cab, and walked back to check the readout by hand, because he did not believe what the monitor was telling him. The field was outperforming the old county soybean record. That mark had stood since Hank Coors' own father set it back in the 1990s, a record Hank had reminded the whole of Marlene's diner about at least twice a season for as long as anyone could remember. And the Whitfield boys' 20 quiet acres were beating it. Word of a thing like that does not stay put in a farming county. It went out from the field to the elevator to the diner within a single afternoon, and it was confirmed the next day when the county extension office ran the official numbers. By the second morning of harvest, the trucks were slowing on Route 9 again, just as they had that first strange morning in the spring. Only now, nobody inside them was laughing. They pulled onto the shoulder and looked out at the golden stubble where the sunflowers had stood, and at the soybean field beyond it still faintly humming with the last of the season's bees, and they tried to understand how the joke of the county had become the best field in it. Hank Coors came himself. He parked at the field's edge and walked the margin with his hands in his pockets, and then he crouched and ran a handful of the harvested beans through his fingers, feeling the weight and the fill of them. When he stood back up, he found Darius, and he did not dodge or soften what he had come to say. "I owe you an apology," Hank said. "I sat in that diner and I said things, and I let other men say worse, and every one of us was wrong. My father's record stood near 30 years, and you broke it in a field everybody told me was wasted ground." He shook his head. "I'd like to hear the whole story if you'll tell it to me. Not the diner version, the real one." Darius looked out at the golden stubble where the sunflowers had stood only weeks before, and then at the soybean field beyond. And when he answered, it was not with a boast, though he'd earned the right to one. "It's not really about the flowers," he said. "It's about paying attention to what's already trying to help you, and giving it a reason to stay." Hank turned that over, and then he nodded. And it was the man revising something he'd believed his whole life, which is a harder thing than most people ever manage. He stayed and heard the real story, standing there at the field's edge while the trucks rolled behind them, and when Darius was finished, Hank shook his hand, and that handshake did more to end the talk in the county than any number on any monitor could have. By the following spring, 3 of the neighboring farms had planted pollinator strips of their own. Some borrowed Darius's bloom time charts directly, copying his figures into their own notebooks. Others called Otis Reyes to ask about placing hives, and Otis, who had spent that whole first summer skeptical and now could not stop talking about it, was glad to tell them. Wendell Marsh heard about the results secondhand, 2 counties over, and drove out one afternoon to walk the fields himself, an old man moving slowly down the rows where his idea had finally been proven at a scale he'd never seen anyone attempt. "You did more with this than most of my old students ever did," Wendell told him. "It's one thing to learn a thing in a classroom. Plenty of them learned it. You trusted it long enough to prove it, and that's the part almost nobody has the stomach for. Darius didn't need the recognition, though it was welcome, and he was gracious with it. What he carried forward from that season was quieter than any of the praise. It was a thing he'd confirmed in himself more than in the soil. That patience and careful attention and a willingness to be doubted for a whole season without breaking were sometimes the exact price of doing something that turned out to be worth doing. Russell still teased him about it sometimes, calling it the great flower experiment over supper, the way fathers reach for a joke to say a thing too large to say plainly. But there was no doubt left underneath the teasing anymore. What had replaced it was closer to admiration, the worn-in kind that only comes from watching someone you love prove themselves the hard way, with the whole world leaning in to watch them fail. The sunflowers went back into the ground again that spring, on different acres this time, rotated according to the next set of calculations already worked out in Darius's notebook. And nobody in the county laughed about it anymore. The trucks still slowed on Route 9 when they passed the Whitfield place, but they weren't slowing to shake their heads and carry a joke into town. They were slowing because they'd learned that when the Whitfield boy did something that didn't make sense yet, it was worth waiting to see what he'd figured out that the rest of them hadn't. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with for a moment, because it isn't really a story about farming at all. Every one of us has at some point seen a thing clearly before anyone around us was ready to see it too. A better way to do the work. A choice that looked foolish from the outside. A quiet conviction we couldn't prove yet, and so we carried it alone, while the people we cared about smiled the way you smile at someone who's about to make a mistake. In those stretches, the loudest voice is almost always the one telling you to explain yourself, to soften the idea, to reach for the shelter and be understood right now. What Darius understood at 18 is something a lot of people go their whole lives without learning. That some things can only be argued by proving them. That being doubted for a season is not the same as being wrong. And that the surest answer to a room full of people who've already decided you've failed is not a better speech. It's a harvest. So here's what I'd love to hear from you tonight. When was the last time you kept believing in something quietly, long after the easy thing would have been to give it up? What was the idea nobody around you could see yet? Drop it in the comments. Read a few of the others while you're down there too, because I promise there's someone scrolling past who needs to know they're not the only one holding on to something. And if Darius's patience reminded you of a patience of your own, consider subscribing and staying a while. This is a channel for people who believe that quiet, stubborn effort still counts for something in the end, and I'd be glad to have you in that company. Wherever you're watching from tonight, let us know. We'll see you in the next one.